Hello, everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up.
Wow.
Hello,
You went in there.
hello. Well, you know, after 160 something times, you gotta find new ways to keep it fresh. Not just for the listeners, but for my own sanity as well. And hello, everyone. Welcome back.
What about my sanity?
And yours. You know, I do it for you, Dylan, of course.
Oh, thanks, Charles.
I feel like as long as I'm entertaining you, I feel like the show will be entertaining. So that's always the
You
goal.
always entertain me.
I appreciate that. Welcome, listeners, to another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
I'm ready to talk a little fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today. Because today we continue our, I don't even know how long of a journey. It's been at least 6 months, maybe longer, that we have been reading the First Law Universe books. We've read the First Law Trilogy. We've read all 3 standalones. We even read Sharp Ends, the short story collection from the world of the First Law. And today marks the beginning of our next and final journey of the First Law, and that is the Age of Madness. We are discussing the first book in the Age of Madness Trilogy today, and that is A Little Hatred. And Dylan, I've got so many opinions. I think we just gotta rush right to the spoiler warning. I will just say, incredible book. Highly recommend reading. Read all the other First Law books up through publication order to this one, and you will not be disappointed. Some of his best work yet, Dylan, as you kept telling me over and over again. I was kind of nervous going into it, knowing that you had said that, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. It's different and it's interesting, and it's not only fun to watch the First Law world grow and change and develop, but it's fun to watch Abercrombie as an author do the same, and all his characters too. So highly recommend.
Wow. Well said, Charles. I'll before I get into spoiler warning, I want to say I am so pumped that you feel that strongly about this book, because you described it as an evolution. That's always how I've thought of Abercrombie's work as we move. It's been quite a journey from the Blade itself all the way up to A Little Hatred, and we're just going to keep it rolling. But now that we are up to A Little Hatred, I do have to give my spoiler warning that we will not be holding back from spoiling all the previous installments in the First Law universe. So that means we consider the original trilogy, all 3 of the standalones, and Sharp Ends to be fair game here, and we aren't going to go out of our way to spoil any of those things, but we certainly aren't going to hold back. So if you don't want any of those previous First Law world books spoiled for you, then now is a good time to turn this down in your headphones before we get into this.
Thank you for that, Dylan. And before we get too far into it, can we just, I don't know what it was, but there were so many deaths at the end of this book that just, they put me in a mood, watching, the Jazal death scene. That was, that hit me in a weird way. Even though the scene itself wasn't anything really to write home about, that was a shocking moment for sure. And then to see, I don't know, there's so many of these moments. I was like, this world is changing faster than I'm ready for it to. I wasn't ready to see old man Jazal and ready for him to go. And it was sad, but it's life must go on, right? That's just how it goes. And Scale also, R.I.P. But we'll get into all of that. I just wanted to make sure I acknowledged that in the beginning.
Yeah. Wow, Charles, you're jumping right to the Giselle death, huh? I mean, as huge fans of the original trilogy and as people who, we see all of Giselle's faults, but as people who have always thought he goes through a lot of growth and even has continued to through Age of Madness and settling into his role as this almost this figurehead that knows he's a figurehead and in that sense is able to serve the role he needs to keep stability in the Union. I think, and, does his best to be as good a father as he possibly could be. It is sad to see him go, and in such an almost inglorious way that is so very true to the Joe Abercrombie voice to not hold back there with how Giselle goes down.
Yeah, and even there was the line of like, where Orso was like, "Oh, my father always said that, common decency is not something like that a king can have," something along those lines, because there were just all these people gathered around his naked, dead body, like poking and prodding him, so yeah, it's true. And it's the end of the times for sure.
So I didn't know we'd be jumping in so quickly, but can I read a last argument of Kings? Quote, Charles?
Okay, book 3 of the First Law Trilogy? All right.
Yes. So this is during that scene in the chapter Behind the Throne near the end of the original First Law Trilogy, where Giselle is getting a talking to from Baez about the way that things work and Giselle's origins, and there's a Bastards kind of stuff. And Baez says to Giselle, "But if you insist on being difficult, if you insist on going your own way, well, there are other options. Even kings die unexplained deaths. Thrown by a horse, choked on an olive pit, long falls to the hard cobblestones, or simply found dead in the morning."
Oh, and you're suspecting foul play here, Dylan?
Well, Baez is very quick to say, "Long live the king."
Yes, he is.
Yes. And he goes on to say, "Life is always short for you insects, but it can be very short for those who are not useful." So, I mean, who's to say if Baez was or wasn't involved in Giselle's sudden death, just unexplained being found dead in the morning.
Yep.
But he did mention that is a possible route that a king could die once they've outlasted their usefulness. So that's all.
That's a very deep pull there for a quote. I love it, and you were well prepared, so thank you for that. Baez said, "Long live the king." Of course he's involved in it in some way. Nothing happens in the Union without Baez knowing about it and pulling the strings one way or the other. So we just don't know why, Dylan. We just don't know why, I'm looking forward to reading future installments to see how this plot thickens here. But let's just go through the characters now and see who we can talk about. We may as well, while we're on the topic of good old Giselle, and we say goodbye to Giselle lovingly, and we look back on all the fond memories we had of his perfect chin and him playing cards with his buddies, fighting in the contest, his good old buddy Logan Nine Fingers, all those things that happen. We can turn the page over to his son, the next generation. Should we talk about Crown Prince Orso?
Yes, let's talk about Crown Prince Orso. And I think of Orso, there's a phrase I brought up before in reference to First Law. I think it was Ladislaw way back. That's a psychological term called affluenza.
Yes.
And that's defined here as a psychological malaise supposedly affecting wealthy young people, symptoms of which include a lack of motivation, feelings of guilt, and a sense of isolation. And I love Orso as a character. And he, to me, is the face of affluenza at the start of this book. He's dealing with all of that. He has no motivation to do much of anything. He is just kind of squandering his life, but he does feel guilty about it, like he is supposed to be doing something more because he is the crown prince.
Right.
But there's these moments where he talks about how he tries to not let anyone down, and therefore he ends up letting everyone down.
Yeah. I mean, there's even like his story opens where he's at a public execution. He's like, maybe I should stop this. And then he just doesn't, and they get hanged, and he's like, oh, I tried, or I did try, you know? So it's like a funny way to introduce him. He's in this weird in-between flux state, like you said, this affluenza, where you can kind of tell he means well, but he's also like spoiled and lazy at the same time. So he never actually accomplishes anything. At least that's how he gets started. And I love the scenes with him and his mother, Queen Therese, like when they go back and forth. Like, it's fun to see Therese take like the spotlight in this book. You know, she's just absolutely dominating with her presence and her quick wit and the way she just like tries to get through to Orso, and there's some of the better scenes of dialogue in the whole book. I remember where she goes, people expect a certain amount of indolence in a crown prince. It was quite winning when you were 17. At 22, it began to become tiresome. At 27, it looks positively desperate. Which pretty much affluenza described.
Exactly. Yeah, and it is interesting because she takes on a much more central role in this book than Giselle does.
Yes.
Giselle's kind of in the background. We get a few scenes of them fencing together, but it's really the tension and conflict is between when in Orso's arc is between Therese's desire for Orso to get is between Therese and Orso because of Therese's desire for Orso to get married. Mm-hmm. And we know that Orso not particularly interested in getting married to the folks that are being presented to him because he is in love with another.
Oh boy.
And this is Charles. So this is Abercrombie's twisted genius at work in my eyes.
Yeah.
Where he pretty much, if you hadn't yet read the First Law trilogy, you would probably be like unabashedly invested in this relationship between Orso and Savine.
Yeah, you'd be like, what's the problem?
They seem to...
Yeah.
Right. They seem to make up for each other's deficiencies. They seem to get along really well. All these things where it's a relationship that I know under normal circumstances, I would be shipping and rooting for to happen.
Right.
But having read the original First Law trilogy, we're already aware coming in.
Oh gosh, I know. And he doesn't spare you on the details, and he goes into everything so intimately, and you're like, oh no. Right away I was like, Joe, no. Yes. You sick person. I love it at the same time. Like, you're brilliant, but also you're sick.
Well, it's interesting that he plays it straight with those two rather like for the sibling or half sibling reveal is not until way late in the book, and this is supposed to be able to stand alone as its own trilogy. Mm-hmm. Like, I think from what I've seen, Joe just wants people to buy his books. So, but he does present it as, you could start with a little hatred, and I think you can, but you're missing out on what Joe is really pulling off here, which is making you sit there with these incest moments where the two characters, it's completely unbeknownst to them.
Yeah.
And it's... Yeah, I mean, I've just never read anything like it.
Yeah, and then the
Really,
dynamic is interesting because Savine finds out, but never tells Orso, and Orso's just left being like, "What the heck?" Like, I guess it's just another person that doesn't want to be around me anymore. It's like typical me, but he doesn't. He still doesn't know, and now Savine, not only does she know what she's done, but she has to like keep it a secret from Orso, who she does love. So it's like such a interesting, twisted, complicated relationship dynamic that's just absolutely fascinating to read. So good.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Orso's character growth throughout this book is catalyzed by mostly just trying to be a better person for Savine. He says Savine makes him want to be a better person. He ends up actually gathering those troops and getting the closest thing that we really get in a Joe Abercrombie novel to like a heroic moment where he saves her and then he proposes, and he's got this whole image in his head of how he's going to be able to turn his life around. And we know that Savine would probably be an amazing queen with her administrative abilities.
Sure.
And then it's all just in the course of one book, we see him go through all of that growth, and then have like not the growth necessarily taken away from him, but the reason being a better person for Savine taken away from him right before he is thrust into a position of having to be the king and take on all this responsibility. So we're left. It's such an amazing arc for Orso. I love him as a character too, and where now we're left thinking, how is he ever going to meet the demands of him in this king position? And if Baez might be involved, what does he have in store for Orso that it was time to put Orso on the throne?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, incest aside, you can look at Orso's arc and be like, this guy's doing great. He's learning how to like make a meaningful relationship with Savine, and he's actually interested in adopting more responsibility, and he wants to raise an army, and he wants to help the rebellion, he wants to be a part of it all. And at the end of the day, it's in Abercrombie fashion. It's like anyone on the quest for personal growth is gonna be in for a bad time. And like you said, the timing of everything is so twisted. Like right at his tipping point, his most vulnerable, when it's like he could be the great king or he could just be totally revert back to himself, is when Savine hits him with that letter. I read that letter. I was like, oh, Joe, that is so cold. Let me pull up the letter here because I have it highlighted in my notes. And I was just so shocked. And it was one of those things where it was, oh, my answer must be no. I would ask you not to contact me again, ever, Savine. That's the note he gets. So savage. It's like, it's so savage. And then, to see her, oh my gosh, yeah. So, like you said, great timing, the way his arc played out. And it's like kind of tragic because what I like about Orso is throughout the whole thing, Joe Abercrombie does hint at his potential. Like, he is a caring guy. He is like an empathetic guy. Like, when he's fighting a duel with his father and he's like, oh, he's obviously setting up like, feint here in this fencing match, but I better let him like do it and just to make him happy. And like he has these qualities about him where he could be a very good ruler. It's just circumstance out of his control is just beating him down constantly. So it's like, will he ever get to learn his lessons? He's like in this environment where it's almost impossible for him to learn his lessons.
Yes, and it's interesting because it's hard not to compare Orso to his dad, Jazal, because he's got so much Jazal in him, because Jazal had a ton of potential as well in all of those ways. And that being said, Jazal at least had something to strive for when he was yes, he was pampered. Yes, he was privileged, but he actually had felt some desire, like I have to win the contest to prove myself, all this kind of stuff, which gave him motivation. But the insecurity of trying to prove himself, I think, was what underlied his narcissism. While Orso doesn't have that narcissism, nor does he have that striving, he's kind of already in this like late stage Giselle type period of just being like, what am I supposed to do from here, and how can I trust any of these relationships as authentic? And it's interesting though, because he, in his own, I guess, like suffering, he's able to develop that empathy that you're talking about, Charles, and he has this like natural wit and desire to do something more, because I feel like once you personally have everything, all you really can do is look outward as what you can try to give to other people. And he does desire that. It's just hard for him to figure out how he's supposed to do that. And he's left, he's left in a tough sitch.
Right. Tough indeed. And I think it's good to kind of compare him to Savine, because which we are moving on to Savine now, because with Savine, she's born into circumstance as well. I mean, she's the daughter of Glocta, who everyone knows runs the show, the most feared man in the Union and all that. Yet she is very enterprising and domineering, and it's so funny. I can read her early dialogue and be like, oh my God, she's in for a hard lesson herself. I can just tell. Because there's even the moments like during the rebellion where, the insurrection, where she's like, how could she have expected this? An armed insurrection. Like that was like in her monologue. It's like, who could have seen this coming? Meanwhile, she's like knowingly impoverishing entire communities and like bankrupting people and making unsafe working conditions. Then she goes, how could this happen? At the same time, it's brilliant character work. And again, it comes to Abercrombie's willingness to commit to a character perspective, to a storyline, without having to remind us of details or contextualize their thoughts. It's like, maybe if she had seen this coming, she could have prevented the thing. It's like, no, she's literally asking, how could this happen, when it's so obvious how it happened. She's just so clueless. Things were going so well for her that the fact that something's going bad just doesn't compute in her brain, even though she's super smart. It's like through circumstance.
Yeah. Well said, Charles. It's interesting to see, despite that privilege, there's been a lot of hard lessons. And even though she's not biologically Glocta's child, she is raised by Sand and Glocta. And it's interesting to see a lot of how the Glocta elements in her, or I guess like Sand elements, I should say, because her last name's Glocta too. So it's, although the name Glocta will always elicit or evoke a different person than her, she'll be Savine. But that being said, when we're first introduced to her, she's big on this idea. The chapter's called, I believe it's Keeping Score. I'll double check that.
That sounds
Keeping
right.
Score. And it's basically just she engages in these business ventures just for the sake of like demonstrating her dominance, winning and beating people. Yeah. And it's a great...
Where have we seen that before, Giselle?
Well, that's an interesting observation. Obviously, as he's her biological dad. I thought of the
introduction to Giselle was him just beating people in cards and taking their money for fun.
That's interesting. Yeah,
I think Savine is actually smart and educated.
Oh, of course.
Where Giselle is just mean, but.
Giselle
share DNA, so it's like interesting to see that where their similarities can be through nurture, I mean nature, not nurture.
Yes. So it's very interesting that you, because I was thinking more of it as Glocta's influence on her. I'll read the quote, which is, uh, she goes, "Why, what a pompous crowd they are. Beyond a point I passed long ago. I don't even care about money." Savine flicked the brim of her hat in farewell. "But how else is one to keep score?" Which I just
Yeah, that's
absolutely
a
love after
great
she's
line.
got this savage moment of trying to, just trying to beat someone into giving her a bigger share of the profit. And I guess I was thinking of the Glocta moments in the original First Law trilogy where he's like basically saying, I'm not afraid to die, but I refuse to lose.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that, yeah, it's an interesting combination of wanting to show dominance over others in this way of Giselle playing cards has that, like, that influence over Savine through nature, and then the nurture is more of the like genuine ambition
Yeah,
that
like
is
just
more Sand and
always be
Glock
scheming,
being
never
like,
lose.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. But it manifests in this almost. She's a powerhouse, Savine. If nothing else, she might be privileged and not know the like, not have the same level of empathy that we might be hoping or awareness about the world outside of her own life, but she is an extremely competent person.
Right. And what I love is like what you are introduced to her in her own POV, and you are familiar with this trope of just someone that's super confident, super successful, knows all the answers, put together. Like you see this, and then like there's a great quote that I had grabbed, but it's not from her POV. It's from Vic's POV.
Yeah.
When Vic sees Savine, and then this is how Vic describes Savine now. Not a hair of Savine's eyebrows, not a thread of her clothes, not a speck of her powder was out of place, even in the heat. All so porcelain perfect, it was a surprise whenever she moved, talked, breathed like ordinary humans. She wore a ridiculous little sword with jewels on the hilt. She wore a tiny, pointless hat fastened with a crystal pin. She fluttered a fan made from fillets of iridescent seashells, gracefully back and forth, back and forth. She had a nest of golden braids, which only a dunce could have imagined was her real hair, or anyone's real hair. Had there been any justice in the world, she would have looked absurd. But Vic knew, well, there was no justice, and she looked spectacular. That's the line. Can you believe that? It's like
Wow.
It's the little details that sell it for me, right? It's the idea of things like this pointless little sword, this obviously fake wig. Like in Savine's head, it's like, oh, these beautiful wigs that make me look gorgeous from real hair, like all this stuff. And it's like, oh, the sword that she made with these jewels cost more than this whole village. And then you have someone like Vic who, like, you know, grew up in the school of hard knocks, looking at Savine and thinking it's all ridiculous. So to see the two compared is where Abercrombie really, really shines, I think. It's such like an Abercrombie thing to be so in one person's head and then be in another person's head and see the character a little bit differently. And you start to see these inconsistencies and you start to actually try and figure out, who is this character really? Like, we know who they think they are. We know who other people think they are. And it just becomes fascinating to see how it all comes together. I don't know. And Savine is one of those ones where she's so confident in the beginning of this book that it was just interesting to me to see that there were like cracks in that, which I wasn't really expecting, but makes total sense in an Abercrombie book.
Oh, yeah. And another moment like that for Savine, I don't want to do her dirty and just talk about her, like, her wake-up calls and stuff, because she has a lot of really triumphant moments and qualities as well, but she does get a wake-up call when she's fighting against Gorst, or at least fenting against Gorst. We have that chapter, Fenting with Father.
Oh yeah, that's a great chapter. Such a great Glocta moment too. Like, Glocta gets some great character moments.
He does. He's pretty much I'm trying to think if this is fair to say. I think him and Dogman, I guess, get the best moments of any of the original uh, point of views.
I like Shivers, but yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking the original First Law trilogy. Shivers gets some fantastic moments for sure. His relationship with Rico, which I'm sure we'll get into more, is heartwarming actually, and his moment where we'll get into it. But the Savine moment I'm talking about is she's fencing against who might be the greatest swordsman alive in Gorst. And she's kind of like, hey, like let's take this more seriously. And Glokta is like, he's kind of like, do you really think you want this? And she's like, yeah, of course. And then he basically tells Gorst, like, okay, like, go for it. Like, show her what actually happens if you try at this. And Gorst just freaking demolishes her. She gets smashed into a wall, which is something pretty out there for someone who's lived such a pampered life. And this is just a taste of what's to come for her, where it's like there's brutality out there, Savine. There's more than your
as like domineering as you can be in like a business setting. Like someone can just walk up to you and punch you and kill you. It's like there's a line that she says during like the rebellion in Valbec where it's like she says, perhaps safety was a lie people told themselves so they could carry on. So these moments where like Gorst just overpowers her like she was nothing instantly is her first wake-up call. And then this whole business in Valbec was also rather alarming as well. And that's when she said this out loud. Perhaps safety was a lie people told themselves so they could carry on. And as smart as she is, as talented as she is, and even shows moments of compassion, and like she has her assistant that she loves, and she sticks to her word and saves her, like that family that was looking out for her. She's capable, and then she is forming this loving relationship with Orso and was even willing to like embrace that love as well. Like some great moments of character. It's still the fact that like how she was raised, the hierarchy in society that she's in. There was another one that let's see here. I was looking for another quote about her. Oh, yeah. Someone called her, let's see. So we have Rosino describing her. And he goes, a most acid, arrogant, and impolite young woman. The exploitative avarice of the modern age personified. Scarcely to be preferred to her father as a dining companion.
Wow.
Which is a bit extreme, but this idea of exploitation in the modern age is certainly like a new theme that's being introduced along with this new setting that is this industrial age for the First Law world. So with the embrace of this industrial age kind of progression in the First Law world and the setting, which is a super interesting thing that we haven't really touched on yet, the fact that this is no longer really a swords and sorcery fantasy. It's getting more into factories and mills and things like that. And Abercrombie then, rightfully so, started to weave in some of the themes that come with industrialization, which is like workers' rights and exploitation of the rich and things like that. And it just all kind of layers on top of each other. And as much as we love to talk about character, I just think with Savine especially, it's interesting to bring up the setting that these characters are in as well.
Yeah, the world is changing, Charles, and Even the Magi know that you gotta be willing
Yeah,
to
Baz is showing up in a sharp suit.
Yeah.
He's like, where's your magic, like your staff? He's like, oh, somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah. It is interesting. Baez's appearances are interesting because we just have the characters, the older characters like Glocta and Jazal being like, stay the F away from that person. Or we have Glocta telling Savine very early on, hey, like Valen and Bulk do not get anywhere near that bank. And it's interesting. I think we don't really get a ton of, I guess, payoff to what Baez's involvement may or may not be in the Age of Madness through just a little hatred. But it's all the hints are being laid down, and it'll be interesting to see where things go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm very fascinated because, you know, with Savine, she wasn't able to, you know, she had that truth bomb dropped on her, which is a fantastic scene, by the way. Artie also, another character that just like word for word is just so incredible. From the first law, like some of my favorite scenes were Artie scenes in the first law. And now here we are with her again as a mother now, as an older woman. And she just shines. It's really incredible. But the scene that I really love is when she breaks the news to Savine. And it's like, you're not hearing me, Savine. Her mother looked up. Her eyes were wet, but there was a hardness in them too. A hardness Savine had not often seen. She pronounced each word with stern precision. You cannot marry Prince Orso. And then it goes on. And what? It's like, Savine's mother squeezed her eyes shut, and a tear black with powder streaked her cheek. He's your brother. Oh, it's like, the scene was crazy. It's like, oh my God, Artie. And you know what Artie went through and how she was kind of like, almost like taking it, not really taking advantage of, but you know, like she was with Jazal and then Jazal got thrust away by Baez and she was kind of left behind. And like the fact that she's facing all of that now, it carries so much weight in so few words. It's a really impactful scene.
That it is. And we know that Savine's reaction to it is she's very bitter about her mother's role in all of this, her father's role as well, and she does lash out afterward, and it's totally understandable from Savine's
she
perspective.
Screams out some stuff that I will not repeat on the show, but the quotes are wild. The quotes are wild, and we're family friendly here, so I'm not gonna read it, but boy oh boy does she reflect on what she has done in this book, and she has no problem screaming it out to her mother in these moments.
And it's interesting because we during the, what they call it, a triumph or whatever, she's also lashing out at Glocta, and we know that she's only been able to live and be born because Glocta came up with a really creative solution to marry Artie when basically he was being told to get her killed. So there would be no Savine if Glocta hadn't really thought on his toes and been willing to. I think he and Artie ended up very happy together,
and like he got the better end of that deal. Let's be real.
That's probably. Well, I mean, they both served each other,
and there were moments in this book where Artie says, "I don't regret anything. I'm happy." Those moments are in this book, so it's like it was a mutually beneficial thing. It was a brilliant idea, and it was a connection. When reading the First Law trilogy for the first time, I never saw coming, never even considered it the first read through. I remember that development and being like, "Of course," but I would have never thought of that.
Yeah. So it's interesting with all the history to put it together, and you empathize with Savine, but because she's had to find out that her whole life has basically been a lie, and of course she's pissed. And at the same time, you empathize with Artie and Sandanglocta because they did their absolute best with just a crappy situation. So it's the beauty of this going across generations that Joe Abercrombie has done with going from the First Law trilogy through the Standalones and into the Age of Madness, where you get to see the complexity in familial circumstances where all parties involved are just trying their best, and still you get these really, really difficult situations. And a tough one for Savine, tough one for Artie, tough one for Glocta.
Tough ones all around. And before we move on to the next character, I found a quote up from Orso that I want to say. It's really quick. Because remember when we were talking about the Jezal chapters and how Abercrombie's just narration was absolutely scathing of Jezal when he was at his most insufferable. There's this scene, and then of course the chapter's called The Man of Action. And the joke there is that Orso never really did anything. He just wore a nice suit. So this is him like greeting the troops for the first time. And he's like, he returned their salute with a flourish he had been perfecting in front of the mirror. He had to admit he liked wearing a uniform. It gave him the novel feeling of being a man of action. And then it goes on to say, perhaps because for once he felt he had done the slightest something towards deserving it when someone paid him a compliment. But it's just this idea of like, it gave him the novel feeling of being a man of action. Like this guy's just been doing nothing his whole life. It's like the idea of being a man of action is this novel experience. It's very funny. And he didn't even earn it. He just put on a uniform. It's just it's more of that wonderful Abercrombie prose.
Definitely, Charles. Well, who's up next among these characters?
We can take our pick. I say while we're in this network of people, let's just go ahead and go to the next one, who in my opinion is none other than Leo Dan Brock.
Wow.
Leo Dan Brock, everybody. This is another interesting character here, the Lion.
The young lion.
And I love throughout this you have the young lion, and then you have what was it, the wolf? But it was the was he just called the wolf? I don't remember.
No, it was oh god, it's not just the wolf. It's
like the
jeez, where. This is an like embarrassing moment.
I know. The Great Wolf. It's the Great Wolf.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, these two characters, pretty fascinating to watch them. It's like, these are people who, like, from reading The First Law, we've learned these lessons already in Abercrombie's world. Like, we know these kinds of people. And it's so funny to hear both of them think back on the Bloody Nine as like someone they aspire to be like, and it's like the Bloody Nine fought in the circle, the Bloody Nine like settled scores, and it's like even the Bloody Nine will tell you that those were horrible ideas. It's like only fools, like we know only fools would worship these people. So when you have these young guys, it's like, history's repeating itself right now. It's just so funny to come into this. Well, how many books are we in now? We're like 8 books deep into this world now. So when we see these characters so green and novice in this, enter this world, we're like, oh my sweet summer child, you've got a lot to learn.
For sure. And I guess I'm skipping ahead here if we go toward fighting in the circle, but might as well.
I love that moment.
Interesting stuff with Leo and Stour, and we just have it's like the same pattern playing itself out with young warriors fighting duels to the death over the same land that it has already been fought over, and it's just and I think it's just Joe Abercrombie's take of there's new generations that rise up, and the old generations, even we see Finrey was awesome seeing Finrey mature and become this very powerful figure.
Yeah,
who
Finrey punching up too.
for for a long time, Baez was having basically still running his interests over in Angland well after the death of Leo's father. And yeah, we have though like those people becoming irrelevant as this new generation steps up, but the new generation hasn't learned these lessons that the old generations have, and oftentimes they don't heed the advice of the older generations. So you get these moments like where Leo is telling the dog man, like, oh yeah, those stories you told me really inspired me, the ones about the Bloody Nine and fighting in the circle and all the glory. And dogman's like, those were supposed to be warnings, man. Like, how did you not take the lessons I was clearly delivering to you? But Leo is a thick-skulled one, and he gets himself into some serious situations due to that folly.
And he's introduced as like a really competent fighter right out of the bat. He's like, barely, he just charges into battle and he's like, we won. And then he like goes to meet with his mother, Finrey, who we know from the Heroes and we know and love from the Heroes, where Baez gives her, you know, the thumbs up. They'll be like, hey, we can make you the governess of England if you play your cards right. And what happened is she's just like, that was a dumb thing to do. You risked everyone's lives. Your friend is dead. When we just had this plan of tactful retreating, you captured a worthless piece of land. And then he's like, what? That's crazy. And then even when it comes down, and a flag. Yeah, he's got the flag. Yeah, that's right. I forgot about the flag. Oh my god. Yeah, that was the whole point of that. He's like, we have their flag. Yeah, the standard. Yeah. Oh god, yeah, that's true. I forgot about that. Yeah, the flag. And even like,
and him and Stour are obsessed with it.
Yeah, they're both
like they both think it's such a big deal.
Right. And then even like when it comes to women, there's a scene that I just like had highlighted from reading where Leo's like, it was then Leo made up his mind that he was interested. I think this was in Riker. And he's like, Rika. Antop knew all about women. If he was impressed, everyone would be. So it's just like one of the 1,000 examples of like, other people are circling around this right now. What? Let me do that too. You know, so he's clearly wandering around aimlessly. And if it wasn't for his mother, who knows what kind of trouble he would have gotten himself in a long time ago. But yeah, it's this interesting idea of like the being part of like the nurture process in these characters. You have Finrey making all these tactical decisions and trying to boss Leo around, and now Leo just like is just walking around being like, what are we doing, guys? Like, what's the next thing? You know, it's interesting. And then of course he's young and arrogant and battle hungry and all these other crazy things that we've had so many characters in this world learn to avoid at all costs.
Yeah, but then each new generation has to learn those lessons anew and thinks they know better than the previous generation. So that's kind of, I feel like Leo personifies that more than any other character. Maybe Stour as well, but Leo, there's like an innocence to him in some ways that Stour comes off much more wicked than Leo, where you're kind of like, it's not shocking that this guy like just wants to like fight and kill people or whatever. But
it's so interesting that he's Calder's son too, which is like this idea that like Calder was this perfect schemer and everything, and yet he can't control his own son. You know, it's like all the layers that are going on in this are so rich and fascinating. I keep saying fascinating, but it's true.
It's true.
It's like super, super interesting. Black Calder, we know from the Heroes.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Calder and Finrey have some stuff in common, and then in terms of their scheming and their logistical mastermindness, don't think that's a word. But that being said, they both have these children with overinflated egos, and maybe in part, both of them saw their roles and usefulness as being the person who can do all of the tactical stuff. And you kind of got this already, Charles. Whereas they were like, oh, well, now my child can just kind of be the face and be this like figure of glory, figurehead that the people need, while I do all the stuff behind the scenes. But then their children didn't learn the lessons of how the sausage gets made, for lack of a better way to put it. And it's like Calder knows how fragile everything is. He's even got that moment, I think, with Sulfur where it's like, hey, remember that pit we took you to? It's like, hey, remember that at any moment this could all be taken away from you. And meanwhile, his kid Stour feels absolutely invincible. And Calder says, like, he looked like Calder's wife died, and he's like, it looked like his mother, so I spoiled him, and he has some reflections on that.
And then there's even, the Great Wolf himself, Scour, even is like, you're a weak old man. And it's like, you don't even realize what he's had to do and how much he's risked and how in the poo-poo he is trying to keep this thing together. And
to keep it clean there, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting. Like, I never really thought to compare Black Calder to Finrey Den Brock, but their story is just as comparable as Leo and Stour. So it's really fascinating to do that because they both are in the same boat, like carrying
rendered irrelevant.
Rendered irrelevant. That's right.
Despite all their scheming and tactical acumen.
They can't control their own kids, and history's doomed to repeat itself. I wonder
single
why.
As well. They're widowed, both of them. Yeah,
single, ready to mingle. Maybe a little love connection.
Yeah, maybe that would be. Oh, Charles, that would be quite a love connection. But imagine what those two could do together.
Imagine the fights that they get in. That would be some high level. No one would win in those debates,
except the reader.
Yeah, that's true. Oh gosh, and I wonder. Also, like, why were they fighting each other if they're both in the pocket of Baez? I guess maybe Baez want them to fight, or maybe was that ever explained?
There is a moment, I think Sulfur has a line, and I don't have the quote or anything in front of me, where he's kind of like a little bit of, I don't know if he says chaos or whatever, but a little bit of like fighting between sides are okay. It kind of keeps people distracted and keeps them busy, where I think what Baez doesn't want is like actual big picture fighting with huge stakes where the person that he is most concerned about still being in charge is at risk.
Right.
But I think like
the government he's
like
built
Orso and Jazal are like, he's much more concerned about what's going on there than that something might happen to Stour Nightfall.
Yeah, right. That's well said. Yeah. So they're just like, hey, we only get involved when it becomes important, and if you guys decide to fight each other right now, it's fine. It's whatever you want.
And he's been busy. Whenever we get introduced to Baez and a little hatred, he's kind of like, I've been dealing with trouble with my siblings all over the place.
Oh, yeah. His siblings are causing him trouble. That's right.
Right. So I think he's kind of been in a mode of, we haven't seen a ton of Baez in a while.
Kalula's gone, so it says in this book,
it's hard
too.
to know exactly.
I mean, they don't say for sure, but it's like, oh, the temple's gone. People are fleeing to Gasca. But
something happened with Pharaoh. We must imagine if we're...
Something happened with Pharaoh. We can deduce, I guess. I mean, she'd be pretty old now by this point.
Well, she's supernatural at this point. With I'm just thinking there's I think it was in one of the standalones. There's a reference to like a woman getting her vengeance in the south, and now Gurkel is a mess. So I think for me, that's where I infer. I'm not operating from any sort of
Like
I'm
second book knowledge.
not spoiling it. Yeah, no, I'm not spoiling anything or anything. I'm just trying to infer from standalone stuff. And,
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, all this stuff kind of reminds me of a quote I almost skipped over from Glockta. Like Glockta's still coming in with these great lines, and it's pretty incredible. I love old Glockta. What can I say? Because you were in his head for so long. When you see him like watching Savine fight, you know what he's kind of going through. And when he says like, "Don't trust the Magi" and all this stuff, but there's a line that he says that kind of stuck with me. It's very Abercrombie, and he goes, "The goal of government, you see," and the Archlector prodded at the air with his bony forefinger, "is to load the unhappiness onto those least able to make you suffer for it." Which is like
that is a jaded man. So do you think, we ended our Glockta character profile with this kind of optimistic view of Glockta as someone who did want to try to make some good out of his position in the Union, and so did Jazal. It does leave you wondering if really any of that was able to be accomplished. It feels like the Union's in a worse place than we left it off in at the end of the first Law Trilogy. So it is sad to see Glockta becoming, it seems like, even more jaded in his old age here.
Yeah, that's true. I always think, Glockta clearly hates everything that he does. Why do I do this is the question he always used to ask himself, which we don't get now because we're not in his
we
POV.
Get the sense it's probably
but he's still asking
in his internal monologue.
Yeah, so the fact that he's talking about like unloading all the suffering on the most vulnerable people is this idea of like, look, this is what you have to do, otherwise we'd all be dead. It's just how this works. But I do think there's those glimmers of hope, and that's why when you see him with Savine, you feel a little good about that, because you can tell that he does care about her and he does care about Artie. Didn't he say like marrying your mother was like one of the best things ever done or something like that? Didn't he say that in this?
He does have I just dropped one of my Abercrombie books. I hope that doesn't.
One of my many Abercrombie books.
Yeah, I've got multiple copies of these books.
Yeah, there's only how many books are there? 7, and you have like 9 books.
Well, don't forget that I also have the Shattered Sea trilogy.
Oh, of course.
So if we're talking Abercrombie books, that I ever underestimated.
Yeah, but you have what? You have 8.
I do.
You have 8 First Law World books, and there's only 7 that exist.
Well, I have the original trilogy. I ended up with multiple copies of every book for reasons I won't get into, and then A Little Hatred. I got a second copy because I found an autograph copy just in my local bookstore, and I was like, I have to get this. Joe wrote in it.
Yeah.
So I was like, anyway, we're digressing. I don't want to do Leo dirty here, Charles, and I want to talk about the actual scene of the circle. I mean, it's
a great
incredible
scene.
Let's
do it.
It's just exhilarating. I know when I was first reading it, I tried to put myself back in my. This is my third A Little Hatred read, Charles.
Wow, I didn't realize you had already read it twice.
Yeah. So the scene when I was first reading it was absolutely exhilarating for me, because you actually have no idea, it feels like, who is going to win, or at least that was where I was. I was like, I actually have no idea who's going to win here. And I've been rereading the book so much up to that point that to have this moment where 2 big characters are fighting with life and death stakes, I just found it really exciting. And it's very almost Mountain versus the Viper, which I'm sure Game of Thrones fans that are listening will pick up on. That I guess I don't want to get too deep into how I'm drawing that connection, because I don't want to spoil Game of Thrones in case folks haven't heard it, but that is what this fight reminds me of.
Yes,
in
yes.
some ways, yeah.
I get what you're saying. I know where you're at. I agree. I thought the same thing. I did. And look, even like at the very beginning of the First Law trilogy, Abercrombie always had a really good sense of stakes in a fight.
Yeah.
Sometimes two people enter a fight in a fantasy book and you're like, there's no way the main character is going to lose. Like, Harry Potter's not going to get killed by Voldemort right now. I don't believe it for a second. But when you have Stour and Leo in the circle together, you're like, anything's possible. Like, yes, Rika had the vision that Leo Rika, yeah. I didn't listen to the audiobook for this one, so you can tell I'm suffering. I don't know why I denied myself Stephen Pacey's greatness for that one, but I'm back to it now for the next book. But
who knows?
Anyway, so it was the issue was like, yeah, she had that vision, but even then it's like that could mean anything. Like, Abercrombie doesn't care about prophetic visions usually, so it's like I really didn't know, and it made sense that he would lose, and you get that back and forth. My money was on Leo to win like the whole time, and he did, but it didn't make it any less exciting. And the way he won, it wasn't like, I'm going to say the word cheap. It wasn't like a cop out. It was like Rika really could use her long eye to see the slash, and she yelled it out, and it was
foreshadowed.
It was foreshadowed
because she has that moment with the arrow.
Yeah, she could see the army advance. She could see Calder's army advance from the flank. Yeah.
I'm even thinking of when the arrow's coming, and she can see like who made it, and she can see where it would end up, and she even see it like rotting away. So I thought that was good foreshadow. Of course, she has the moment in the battle as well, but
where she sees a guy walking up and looking up, and then that person comes later and does like
the nail.
Yeah, the nail. That's right.
Nail, Charles.
I was gonna say it was like white something, but no, it was the nail. It was the nail.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. I love that. And I also love, Logan versus the Feared was another great fight in the circle moment. He can write action and battle scenes and stakes super well. It's like, yes, we all love his grimdarkiness, his subversions, his character work, but we cannot discount Abercrombie for his action scenes and his, stakes.
Yeah, well said, Charles. It's one of the first things I pick up on, I think, reading the Blade itself. It's like right off the bat with a fight scene, and he grounds you in action so well, and the little hatred certainly, I think, ramps it up even more, and all the battles are incredibly well depicted. I think he went a little bit more like epic and less slipping around and kind of way, because he was big on in the First Law trilogy, the original, he was big on this like how messy fighting
is. Yeah, Logan would like trip and fall on his ass and yelp out in pain and stuff. Like, it gets kind of silly. Yeah.
Yeah. Here he went in a little bit more. He never loses the grittiness of fighting,
right,
or the realism of it, but he went more epic and less chaotic, I think, with the way that he depicts these fights in A Little Hatred, depending on the perspective. In Rika's perspective during the fight, it's like, what is going on? And Clover kind of has his own way of viewing fighting. But Charles, I'm realizing we're like an hour in and we've only talked about
we got a lot of characters. We got Orso, Savine, we got Leo. Those are arguably the biggest ones. There's still Rika is another big one, and then you have Vic, Gunnar, and Clover, which you could do those pretty quickly. But can we do all of them in 30 minutes? Like, that's the question here.
I'd be doing them dirty.
I would be doing them dirty, and there's still a lot to talk about beyond characters as well. There's still, like, we touched on setting a little bit, but there's so many interesting themes that go along in this book beyond just what's going on with the character arcs that I think would be worth talking through and talking about what happened with this, like, workforce rebellion and how that, like, where he's drawing from history, and like there's all those influences I think we could talk about as well. And yeah, are you suggesting that we stop here? Like, what's the?
Because I'm just thinking I don't want to do this book dirty, and maybe we do this as our part one is basically discussing Orso, Savine, and Leo with whatever digressions we had, and then see if then we could do a little hatred part two that discusses, get into more plot and setting and things like that, as well as making sure we discuss Ricka, Gunnar, Clover,
Vic and Clover.
And Vic, and really give them their due, because all those characters are so great. I don't want to try to fit them into 30 minutes or whatever.
Yeah. I'm not saying like we'll do a part two. I guess the question is, knowing that we're going to do a part two, are we going to now? And this is really fascinating content, guys. I'm sure you're at the edge of your seats. Are we going to call it here? Are we going to try and squeeze in another character? Are we calling it a day?
Let's get it. Do you think we could do one more character? Probably we couldn't do Ricka. Probably there's too much.
Yeah, I think we can get. You want to just do you want to do Gunnar maybe? Because we touched on Savine a bit. Or maybe Clover. I don't know. Because Gunnar.
Let's go Gunnar.
Okay, we'll go Gunnar. Okay. So Gunnar, guys. Wow, this character comes out of the gate strong. He's a ladderman, and he's done it 4 times, which is like an insane thing to do. So he's a hard guy. And the thing about Gunnar that strikes me is there's this thing that we've seen a few times with Abercrombie, but with Gunnar it's just represented a little bit more differently, where here's someone who loves violence and loves to hurt people, but also has a family that he loves and wants to be with, and is trying to put all of that behind him. But for some reason, he's such a good, useful fighter, and trouble always finds him. And he keeps going down that path no matter what good he tries to do. And the spectacles were an interesting touch as well.
Right. So Gunnar is someone who Abercrombie's done a lot of characters like this, as you're getting at there, Charles. And right away, I found myself thinking about all those characters, and Logan Ninefingers is probably the one that first comes to mind as a character who's trying to put this warrior's past behind them and just settle down and have an easier life. And Gunnar, though, is unique in a lot of ways. The first thing that sticks out is he's a family man. And
yes,
I don't think that Abercrombie's ever really done this one with a true family man. I could be wrong there, or a family person. I could be wrong. Maybe you can think of someone, but if not, I'll just keep going with this.
Keep going,
and he has very good reason outside of himself to change who he is. And he's got a loving wife. He's got a wonderful, whip-smart daughter. And they really, really care about him. And right away, though, we see him. He's just fought so hard for the Union.
Right.
And he comes back to have everything. He's really, I would think, trying to have this simple farm life. And meanwhile, all of it's been taken from him because of like taxes, basically, and people taking his land to have more power than him. And he gets to be the face of this disenfranchised everyman in the Union. And I think it's really interesting with all of the rebellion going on to get to be grounded in the perspective of someone who's actually facing all of these like awful experiences that they're going through and genuinely trying his best. You really empathize with Gunnar, I think.
I agree completely, and I think it's very calculated by Joe to make this guy a family man and every man kind of person, jaded member of the common folk, because a huge theme in this book is just about civil liberties and workers' rights and like how progressions in technology and booms in the economy just continue to oppress most people, and that people are actually being treated worse than they were before amidst all this innovation and revolution going on from an industrial standpoint. So to have someone who fought for his country and is now like kind of traumatized by it, who just wants to live a simple life, and the fact that he can't do that and the fact that he can't escape violence, I think is Abercrombie's further exploration of like this is more of the common man's perspective, because Leo, Orso, Savine, they're all like royalty 1%ers. So to have a character like this one, it's super fascinating because poor Gunnar, he never had any of that, and he's just trying to survive. And people just come to him and it's like, this land is ours now. We're like building a mill here. And he just beats them up and kills them.
He kills one.
He kills them. And then
but not the person who's actually taking his land, just another person who's
a grunt, basically.
A grunt. Yeah.
And that's this idea, because there's another theme going on here that's kind of explained by the judge, which happens during the whole overthrowing thing, where they do like the mock court. And it's like, you don't have, I reject this court, I denounce it. And then the judge is like, we have the authority of the fist. We have the authority of sharpened metal. We have the authority of force, you blubbering C word, which is the only real authority there is. And I think that's part of Gunnar's character. He's more than capable of being violent and beating people in a fight, but he's incredibly powerless. So it kind of juxtaposes the judge's idea of like, we have the power of the fist. And it's like, yeah, well, that only gets you so far. And it doesn't solve your problems. It's not true resolution. It's just scores on scores on scores. And I think by having Gunnar grounded by a loving wife and child, which I do want to give shout out to family man Bethod. Okay, like he did have a loving wife and kids. Calder also wife and kids. They're all family men. Logan took a stab at it, but I wouldn't call him a family man.
Yeah, I'm saying neither Bethod nor Calder is really a straightforward play of the person trying to put the really violent path behind that. Bethod's interesting. He's also not a point of view character in anything.
Except Sharpens.
True. I knew you were gonna. So yes, Charles, you are correct. He is a point of view in Sharpens. That being said,
no, it's very different.
I think it's like Shivers is an example of a person who in the hero, or sorry, not in the heroes, in Best Served Cold, that is Shivers' arc completely, is trying to put a violent past behind him and start new, but he doesn't have a family depending on him. And then of course Logan, did he try it? Yes,
but the kids were more of like
trilogy
the kids were more of
like an idea, backstory.
Yeah, and like something to chase after too. In Red Country, he was supposedly a family man in that, he was, which he is, but it just more pointed out how inappropriate he was there and that he had to move on, which made him a coward also. So,
right.
But this,
he's at a different stage. But that's a good point that Logan as Lamb does get sort of some family man elements, but it only
goes to highlight how Lamb is very obviously not a family man, even when he's pretending to be. He's not.
Right.
And whereas Gunnar is wholly and truly a family man. There's an important
Right.
distinction there. Like, Lamb is trying to have a family dynamic like Gunnar actually has. And that is what grounds his character, and also the fact that they're just totally powerless, even though he can
Well said.
beat up anybody. He's still completely powerless. And it's just another sign of the times changing, where it's not like whoever's the most dangerous within arm's reach is king here. There's all these other systematic things going on as a result of this industrial boom that keeps people like Gunnar behind, and it's only when they were cherry-picked by Savine that they got to live a second life. But even then, you're not really sure how much better off Gunnar is. I mean, he's obviously now has money, so they're happy, but his story ends just kind of like he's been marked as someone who is like a grunt who can hurt people, and he's being used for that purpose, and he's lying to his family now. So that's the kind of where his arc ends. And I'm not quite sure how to feel about him. It's like, this, at some part you have to be realistic about these things. In the other part, we're entering a refined age. You don't want to be doing that to your family.
Right. I feel like Gunnar, it doesn't feel like he makes as many excuses for himself as Logan.
No, he does not. And he's very honest. He goes right to his wife and is like, I beat that dude up. And she's like, it's okay, we'll get through it. Very healthy relationship they have.
Yeah, as healthy a relationship as you can have with someone like Gunnar. Yeah. I feel like
someone as heavily traumatized. You are trying to,
right.
They're great communicators. I'll say that.
Who's just they are. Yes, and she is unconditionally supportive. Yeah, I know. It's like, how did he end up with her? She, somehow puts up with. I mean, you can tell he's well-meaning, Gunnar,
yes.
And I do like him. It's just when it's violent times, and you're a person who everyone looks at and immediately sees as someone who can contribute through violence. It's just really, really hard to get out of it. And he makes a genuine effort at it. Then there's that like horrific scene, well written, but horrifying, I guess. Scene with the child getting burned up and
in the chimney.
Yeah. And you see how Gunnar gets completely disillusioned after everything he's been through. So just a good, an interesting face on the disenfranchisement, the disillusion, the frustration of being a common person, an interesting character with these contradictions of being a family man and being, actually he does like violence. You can tell, like, it's in some way it's when he feels most natural.
It's like instinctual for him. He's always clutching his fists or realizing his fists are clutched. He's instinctually, spiritually a warrior. So the fact that he's got to like keep it in check for his family and for like conforming with society is kind of an interesting thing.
He saves Savine.
He saves Savine. He does. Yeah. Not knowing who she is. Just to his daughter the whole time knew, Lydia or May. Yeah, I have Lydia and May. One's the other. And the fact that he's just kind of going along with it just to be supportive is kind of a stand-up thing to do. He just got to look out. He's got a bit of a temper to him, and he's capable of violence. And this book basically ends with him realizing that he's hired muscle. And we'll see where that gets him in the next book.
Yes, we will, Charles.
But we can't go on to the next book yet, guys. We cannot go into The Trouble with Peace because we are going to have a part 2 of A Little Hatred. We're going to pick up where we left off here today. I know all you Ricka fans are upset, but don't worry, it's coming. Okay, all you Clover fans
Use
out
your
there,
long eye
I
to
will
see
say,
into the future,
like,
with that Rick episode coming.
yes, that long eye vision. I see it. I can see the fade of us talking about it, and it's just I'm gonna have time until it happens. And Clover, oh my God, Clover's
Clover.
end. The end of this book with Clover.
Oh my God,
flipping shocking and incredible.
Yes,
and
two
it
of my
happens
favorite moments in the whole book.
right at the same time as Jazal's death, and then the whole thing with Scale, and then Wonderful. I'm like, I can't handle all this.
And Wonderful, we got to know well. We'll get into it more, but we got to know well, and the heroes.
Yes,
it's just Abercrombie does such a good job.
Short stories and the sharp ends, we got to learn even more about Wonderful.
True.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that scene is crazy, shocking, and we are going to share all our feelings on that. So don't worry, guys, it's all coming. And then there's all kinds of industrial revolutionary themes that we're going to be pouring over, and just talking about Abercrombie's writing, and maybe even doing a little comparison to the Blade itself, because I think there's some interesting things happening here. And but for now, guys, we are going to call it a day, and we will see you next time. Right, Dylan? Is there anything else we need to say before we play that sweet, sweet outro music?
I think it's time to get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. This has been your co-host, Charles and Dylan. If you like what you heard today, that is most definitely us, and you want to support the show, you want to support us, Charles and Dylan, then reach out to us over on social media at the FDF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter, and at FDF Podcast on Instagram. And be sure to drop a follow, leave some comments. We like to reply to people's comments and tags and things. Yeah. So come on over.
On the episode announcement.
Ooh, that's a good one.
That's a great place to get conversation started on this episode.
Very well said.
I feel like we just throw them onto Twitter. It's like, you got
let's get that conversation going. Yeah, let's
get the conversation going.
There's an episode announcement out now on our Twitter page, guys. Go find it, drop a comment, let us know what you think. It will be at some point today, and if it's not, then you can reach out to Dylan at Dylan R. Marsh and complain at him directly on Twitter. But until then, guys, if you like what you heard, and you, Dylan, I have a question for you.
Yeah, don't.
If the listeners like what they heard, and they just so happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, and what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Yeah.
You should find that Friends Talking Fantasy page on the Apple Podcast app. You want to click the Friends Talking Fantasy page, then scroll down past all those episodes until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the optimal number of stars to click in order to support the show would be 5 of them. If you've got a little bit of extra time, then writing a review is extremely helpful for a podcast like ours. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you all so much for listening. That alone, we are eternally grateful. Thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.